The first police cruiser rolled into our driveway at exactly 7:12 on a Tuesday morning. I remember the time because my dad, Frank Dawson, had just poured coffee into his favorite chipped navy mug when red and blue lights flashed across the kitchen window. The sunlight outside disappeared beneath the spinning reflections. Dad looked up slowly. "You expecting company?" he asked. I laughed. Not unless the cops suddenly deliver breakfast now. But Dad didn't laugh. Something about the way those officers parked felt wrong. Heavy, like they weren't here for questions. They were here for somebody. I followed Dad outside onto the porch. The summer heat already hung thick over the subdivision. Perfect green lawn stretched across the neighborhood like identical carpets. Except ours. Our lawn wasn't dead. It wasn't ugly. It was simply natural. Dad stopped using expensive chemical treatments after Mom passed away 3 years earlier. He said she loved wildflowers too much to poison the soil. So instead of artificial perfection, patches of clover grew through the grass. Small yellow flowers bloomed near the mailbox. Butterflies gathered there every morning. Apparently, that was enough to start a war with the HOA. The lead officer stepped out. Frank Dawson. Dad nodded carefully. "That's me." The second officer opened the rear door of the cruiser. My stomach dropped. "So," the first cop said, "we have a warrant related to repeated violations, refusal to comply with county orders, and obstruction regarding community enforcement penalties." "Excuse me." I snapped. Dad looked stunned. "There has to be a mistake," he said calmly. The officer sighed. "Mr. Dawson, we're not here to argue. We're here to execute the warrant." Then she appeared. Helen Cartwright, president of the Oak Valley Estates HOA. The woman everybody secretly called HOA Karen. She stood across the street wearing oversized sunglasses and a smug smile so wide it looked painful. Her arm folded tightly across a bright pink blazer, like she'd been waiting all morning for this exact moment. And honestly, she probably had. Finally, Helen announced loudly enough for the neighbors to hear. Maybe now this street can look respectable again. Dad turned toward her, not angry, just disappointed. "Helen," he said quietly, "you really did this over grass." "It's not grass," she snapped. "It's negligence. You've lowered property values for 2 years. Neighbors began stepping outside. Curtains opened. Phones came out. Nobody spoke, because everybody in Oak Valley knew Helen, and everybody knew she loved power more than oxygen. 3 months earlier, she fined a widow for leaving Christmas decorations up too long after her husband died. She threatened another family because their teenage son fixed motorcycles in the garage. She even cited a veteran for parking his wheelchair ramp too close to the sidewalk. But my dad, for some reason, she hated him most. Maybe because he never bowed to her. Maybe because everybody respected him. Or maybe because Dad had once publicly embarrassed her during an HOA meeting. That was a beginning. At the annual community board meeting, Helen proposed raising HOA fees by 40%. She claimed it was necessary for community beautification projects. Dad stood up in front of everyone. "You mean the private pool renovation behind your house?" The room went silent. Helen's smile disappeared instantly. Dad continued. "Funny how the budget includes landscaping around your property specifically." Several neighbors started flipping through paperwork. Then the whispers began. Helen never forgave him for that. Not after residents forced the board to cancel the increase. And now here we were, 2 police officers standing on our driveway, my father being handcuffed over his lawn, while Helen watched like she'd just won the lottery. "This is insane," I said. The officer looked uncomfortable. "Sir, if you want to dispute the matter, you can do so in court." Dad raised his hands calmly. "I'm not resisting anybody." The cuffs clicked shut. That sound still echoes in my head, because my father wasn't a criminal. He was a retired Navy mechanic who spent 30 years fixing ships. He coached Little League, helped neighbors repair roofs after storms, delivered groceries to elderly residents during the pandemic. But none of that mattered to Helen Cartwright. All she cared about was control. As officers guided Dad toward the cruiser, Helen walked closer. Too close. "Maybe jail will teach you respect for community standards," she said smugly. Dad stopped. Then he looked directly at her. "No, Helen," he said softly. "What's about to happen is going to teach this neighborhood who you really are." For the first time all morning, her confidence flickered. Only for a second, but I saw it. The officers drove away, and Helen smiled again. "Your father should have learned not to challenge me," she said. I stepped toward her. "You arrested a grieving widow over Clover." "Rules are rules," she replied coldly. Then she walked away. But the story should have ended there. Small-town abuse of power. Another HOA nightmare. Another bully getting away with it. Except Helen made one critical mistake. She pushed too hard, because what she didn't know was that somebody very important had already started investigating Oak Valley Estates. And within 48 hours, our neighborhood would become national news. Not because of the lawn, not because of Dad, but because Helen Cartwright's entire empire was about to collapse live on television. And the person exposing her? The mayor himself. Dad spent 6 hours in county holding before they finally released him. No criminal charges. No violent offense. No actual threat to society. Just unpaid HOA violations converted into court enforcement actions after months of legal pressure. Helen had weaponized the system. And technically, she knew exactly how to do it. When I picked Dad up from the station that evening, he looked exhausted. Not physically, emotionally, like something inside him finally understood how ugly people could become. We drove home mostly in silence. Then Dad looked out the passenger window. "You know what hurts most?" I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "What?" "Your mother planted those flowers." That nearly broke me. Mom loved gardening. Not the rich neighborhood country club version. Real gardening. Wildflowers. Native plants. Bees. Butterflies. She used to kneel in the dirt for hours while Dad followed behind her carrying tools and pretending to complain. After cancer took her, Dad kept the lawn exactly the way she loved it. That lawn wasn't neglect. It was memory, and Helen had turned it into a crime scene. When we pulled into Oak Valley Estates, neighbors stared from their windows. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked afraid. But none came outside. Nobody wanted to become Helen's next target. Except one person. Mrs. Alvarez from 2 houses down walked straight across her yard carrying a casserole dish. She was 73 years old and feared absolutely nothing. "Frank," she said, hugging Dad tightly, "this neighborhood should be ashamed." Dad smiled weakly. "Thank you, Maria." She glanced around before lowering her voice. "People are talking." Dad raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "About Helen's money." That got my attention immediately. Mrs. Alvarez leaned closer. "A lot of residents think she's stealing from the HOA fund." Dad looked unsurprised. "I've suspected that for a while." "Then why didn't you say anything?" Dad sighed. "Because accusations without proof only make people defensive." But proof existed. We just didn't know it yet. That night, around 11:40 p.m., somebody knocked on our front door. Not politely, urgently. I opened it to find Ethan Miller, 22 years old, college dropout, former HOA office assistant. And terrified, he stepped inside quickly. "You need to lock the door," he whispered. Dad frowned. "Ethan, what's going on?" The kid looked pale, sweating, shaking. Then he pulled a flash drive from his hoodie pocket. "I copied file from the HOA office before Helen fired me," he said. Dad's expression changed instantly. "What kind of files?" Ethan swallowed hard. "Financial records, emails, meeting notes." I looked between them. "Why bring them to us?" He laughed nervously. "Because your dad's the only person in this neighborhood who isn't scared of her." Then Ethan said the sentence that changed everything. "Helen's been using HOA money to pay local officials for favors." The room went dead silent. Dad stared at him. "That's a serious accusation." "I know," Ethan whispered. "That's why I quit." We sat at the kitchen table while Ethan explained. According to him, Helen controlled Oak Valley Estates like a private kingdom. Selective fines, fake landscaping contracts, personal expenses hidden inside maintenance budgets. But the worst part? She allegedly had connections inside the county zoning office. Whenever residents challenged violations, cases mysteriously disappeared. Whenever Helen pushed enforcement actions, approvals happened unusually fast, including Dad's arrest warrant. I looked at Ethan. "Why didn't you go to police?" He laughed bitterly. Because Helen plays golf with half the people in county government. Dad plugged the flash drive into his laptop. Folders appeared instantly. Budgets, invoices, emails, payment records. Then Dad opened one file, and everything changed. A scanned invoice showed HOA funds paying $12,000 for community security upgrades. The listed address? Helen Cartwright's private home. Another file showed landscaping payment for areas that didn't exist. Then came emails, dozens of them. Helen threatening residents, manipulating board votes, bragging about connections. One line froze the room. If Dawson keeps pushing, I'll make an example out of him. Dated 3 weeks before Dad's arrest. My blood boiled. She planned this. Dad stayed calm. Too calm. That usually meant he was furious. Then Ethan opened another folder. You haven't seen the biggest part yet. Inside were recordings, audio files, secretly captured during HOA board meetings. Dad clicked one. Helen's voice filled the kitchen. The mayor's office keeps asking questions about missing reserve funds, she said irritably. We need everything cleaned up before the audit. Dad paused the recording. Audit? Ethan nodded. The city started investigating several HOAs last month after residents filed complaints. Then he leaned closer. Helen thinks she can intimidate everyone into silence before investigators dig deeper. Suddenly the arrest made sense. Dad wasn't targeted because of the lawn. He was targeted because he asked questions, and Helen needed an example. She wanted the entire neighborhood afraid. But fear works both ways, because now Ethan was scared too. She knows I copied files, he whispered. Dad looked at him carefully. Did she threaten you? Ethan hesitated, then nodded. She told me people who betray her regret it. At that exact moment, headlights flashed through our window. A black SUV slowed outside the house. Nobody spoke. The vehicle stopped for several seconds, then drove away. Ethan looked sick. Dad stood immediately. You're not going home tonight. Frank. No arguments. You stay here. That was my father. Even after being humiliated publicly, even after getting arrested, his first instinct was protecting somebody else. Around midnight, Dad made a phone call. Not to police, not to a lawyer, to somebody named Marcus Reed. I recognized the name immediately. Marcus Reed was a local investigative reporter, the kind politicians hated. Dad had helped him years earlier during hurricane relief projects. When Marcus answered, Dad kept it simple. You still interested in corruption stories? A pause. Then Marcus replied loudly enough for me to hear. Depends. How corrupt are we talking? Dad looked at the laptop screen, then at the flash drive, big enough to end careers. By morning, everything was moving fast. Too fast. Because once reporters started digging, they discovered something Helen never expected. The mayor's office wasn't just auditing HOA finances. They were preparing a full public investigation. And somebody inside City Hall had already flagged Helen Cartwright months earlier. The arrest of my father? That was a spark. The story exploded online overnight. Videos of Dad in handcuffs spread across social media. Local residents began sharing their own HOA horror stories. Former board members started talking anonymously, and by Thursday afternoon, television news vans lined our street. Helen still thought she was untouchable. She even gave interviews. That turned out to be the biggest mistake of her life. By Thursday morning, Oak Valley Estates looked less like a suburban neighborhood and more like a crime documentary set. News vans lined the entrance. Reporters stood on sidewalks. Drones buzzed overhead. Residents who normally avoided eye contact suddenly gathered outside pretending to water plants while listening to interviews. And right in the center of it all stood Helen Cartwright, smiling. She actually thought this attention would help her. That's the thing about arrogant people. They confuse fear with respect. Helen believed years of intimidation made her powerful. She didn't realize everybody had simply been waiting for someone brave enough to fight back. That someone turned out to be my dad, even though he never intended to become the face of a scandal. At 9:15 a.m., a local news station interviewed Helen live outside the HOA clubhouse. She wore a white designer suit, pearl necklace, perfect makeup. The performance of a woman convinced cameras automatically meant victory. Our community maintains very high standards, she told reporters confidently. Unfortunately, some residents repeatedly refused to follow regulations agreed upon by homeowners. Then she smiled directly into the camera. No one is above the rules. That clip went viral within an hour. Not because people supported her, because people hated her instantly. Comments flooded social media. She arrested a widow over flowers. This woman sounds evil. HOAs are completely out of control. Then former residents started posting stories. One family claimed Helen fined them weekly while secretly violating the same rules herself. Another resident shared photos of Helen's personal gardener using HOA equipment. A retired teacher revealed she paid thousands in questionable penalties after challenging budget increases. Suddenly the narrative shifted. This wasn't about lawn maintenance anymore. It was about corruption. And the public smelled blood. Meanwhile, inside our house, Dad stayed surprisingly calm. Marcus Reed arrived around noon carrying coffee in a camera bag. He spread printed documents across our dining table. "This is bigger than I thought," he admitted. Dad crossed his arms. "How big?" Marcus pointed at financial statements. Potential fraud, misuse of public funds, maybe bribery. I looked up sharply. Public funds? I thought this was just HOA money. Marcus nodded. Mostly. But Oak Valley received city beautification grants 2 years ago. If Helen redirected those funds illegally, this becomes a municipal issue. That explained the mayor's involvement. Marcus continued. I contacted 2 former city employees this morning. Both mentioned complaints about Helen going back years. Dad frowned. Why wasn't anything done? Marcus laughed bitterly. Because people like Helen survive by staying just inside legal boundaries. Enough intimidation to silence people. Enough paperwork to confuse investigators. Then he tapped the flash drive. But these recordings, these changed everything. Around 2 p.m., another bombshell dropped. Marcus aired excerpt from the HOA recordings during a live broadcast. The entire city heard Helen's voice, threatening residents, discussing hidden expenses, mocking homeowners behind closed doors. Then came the line that detonated online. Fear keeps communities orderly. Public reaction exploded. National pages reposted the clip. TikTok creators mocked her relentlessly. One video comparing Helen to movie villains hit 2 million views overnight. But the real damage happened inside Oak Valley itself. Neighbors who spent years staying silent suddenly found courage. People began walking to our house. One after another. A disabled veteran named Carl brought copies of violation notices Helen issued against him. A single mother showed letters threatening foreclosure over unpaid fines. An elderly couple revealed they'd been pressured into paying for unnecessary landscaping services connected to Helen's friends. Every story sounded the same. Control, intimidation, retaliation. By evening, our dining room looked like an evidence center. Documents covered every surface. Dad rubbed his forehead. How did nobody stop this sooner? Mrs. Alvarez answered quietly from the kitchen. Because people were scared of losing their homes. That sentence hung heavily in the room. Because she was right. HOAs hold enormous power. Fines become liens. Liens become legal threats. Most families can't afford endless legal battles. Helen knew that. She weaponized exhaustion. But then something unexpected happened. At exactly 6:43 p.m., the mayor released a public statement. Every local station interrupted programming. Mayor Daniel Brooks appeared behind a podium inside City Hall, and he looked furious. The allegations emerging from Oak Valley Estates are deeply disturbing, he said firmly. Our administration has already initiated a formal review into HOA financial activities connected to municipal grant programs. Reporters shouted questions. The mayor raised a hand. Let me be absolutely clear. No resident should face intimidation, selective enforcement, or abuse of authority from any organization operating within the city. Then came the line that changed everything. If wrongdoing occurred, those responsible will answer publicly. Publicly, Helen must have panicked hearing that, because 30 minutes later, she posted a video statement online accusing the media of harassment. That backfired catastrophically. Instead of appearing confident, she looked angry, desperate, sweating. She blamed jealous residents, political agendas, and internet mobs. Then she made the mistake nobody could defend. She referred to my father as an emotionally unstable man obsessed with revenge. The internet destroyed her, especially after people discovered Dad's military background and volunteer work. Support flooded in. Veterans groups reposted his story. Community activists demanded investigations. Former residents contacted reporters from other states. And through it all, Dad stayed focused on one thing: truth. Late that night, Marcus received an anonymous email. No signature, no name, just one attachment. Security footage. The video showed Helen inside the HOA office shredding documents after midnight. The timestamp was from the previous evening. Marcus stayed at the screen. She's trying to destroy evidence. Dad nodded slowly, which means she knows what's coming. Then my phone buzzed. Emergency City Council announcement. A special public hearing had been scheduled for Friday evening. Live broadcast. Mayor Brooks himself would address Oak Valley Estates. Helen probably assumed she could talk her way out. She didn't understand something crucial. The mayor wasn't planning damage control. He was preparing an execution. Political, public, and devastating. Friday evening felt electric. Not exciting. Dangerous. By 5 p.m., crowds surrounded City Hall. Residents from across town gathered outside holding phones, signs, and printed screenshots of Helen's viral interviews. News helicopters circled overhead. Police barricades lined the entrance. Inside, the main chamber overflowed so badly people stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls. I'd never seen anything like it. Not for local politics. Not for an HOA scandal. But this had become bigger than Oak Valley. To the public, Helen represented every nightmare neighborhood tyrant people hated. And everyone wanted front row seats to her downfall. Dad sat quietly beside me in the second row. Navy posture. Hands folded. Calm exterior. But I could tell he was tense. Across the chamber, Helen entered with 2 attorneys. The room instantly erupted into whispers. She tried looking composed. But for the first time since it started, fear showed clearly on her face. Because tonight she couldn't control the room. No HOA rules. No selective fines. No intimidation. This wasn't her kingdom anymore. At exactly 6 p.m., Mayor Daniel Brooks walked onto the stage. The chamber fell silent. Brooks wasn't flashy. No dramatic personality. No political showman energy, which made his expression even more unsettling. He looked genuinely angry. "Good evening," he began. Television cameras adjusted instantly. This emergency session concerned serious allegations involving Oak Valley Estates Homeowners Association leadership and the misuse of authority against residents. Then he looked directly toward Helen, including actions that may violate municipal and state law. Helen's attorney stood. "Mayor Brooks, my client objects to—" "Sit down," Brooks interrupted coldly. The entire room froze. Even reporters stopped typing. Brooks continued. "For years, complaints regarding Oak Valley Estates were ignored, minimized, or buried beneath procedural delays. That failure ends tonight." Then the mayor gestured toward a large screen. Documents appeared instantly. Financial records, invoices, grant payments, photos, emails. The room buzzed with shock. Brooks pointed toward highlighted figures. City investigators uncovered over $200,000 in questionable expenditures connected to HOA-controlled accounts. Helen's face lost color. Gasps echoed throughout the chamber. Then Brooks dropped the first bomb. Several payments labeled as community improvement projects were redirected toward private properties associated with HOA leadership. Photos appeared on screen. Helen's backyard pool, luxury landscaping, outdoor renovations, all allegedly funded using HOA money. The audience exploded. Her attorney jumped up again. "These accusations aren't verified." Brooks didn't even look at him. "Actually," he replied calmly, "they were verified this morning by forensic auditors." Helen gripped the table so hard her knuckles turned white. Then came the recordings. The same secret audio Ethan copied. Only this time, the mayor played longer sections. Helen's voice filled the chamber. Mocking residents, discussing retaliation, laughing about fines. Then the worst clip played. If Dawson embarrasses me again, I'll ruin him publicly." The room went silent. Every camera immediately turned toward Dad. Brooks lowered his notes. "Frank Dawson." Dad looked up. "Please stand." Dad hesitated, then slowly rose. The mayor faced the crowd. This man was arrested over landscaping violations while simultaneously raising concerns regarding financial misconduct inside the HOA. He paused. "That timing is deeply suspicious." Helen suddenly stood. "This is political theater," she shouted. The crowd erupted. Brooks finally looked directly at her, and his next sentence destroyed her. "Mrs. Cartwright, would you like me to discuss the deleted emails recovered from your office computers?" Helen froze. Complete silence. Brooks continued, "Including messages discussing retaliation strategies against residents who questioned HOA spending." Her attorney whispered frantically beside her. Too late. The mayor turned back toward cameras. "Ladies and gentlemen, this investigation uncovered a pattern of intimidation, selective enforcement, financial misconduct, and abuse of authority." Then he said the words everybody remembered. "No neighborhood association in this city operates above the law." Applause thundered through the chamber. Helen looked completely shattered. But Brooks wasn't finished. He signaled again. A final video appeared. Security footage from the HOA office. Helen shredding documents. Timestamp visible. Clear as day. The room exploded into chaos. Reporters rushed forward. People shouted. Cameras flashed nonstop. Helen's attorney grabbed her arm. "We're leaving," he hissed. But before she could move, the mayor delivered the final blow live on television. "Based on evidence presented to city investigators, we are formally referring this case to the district attorney's office of potential criminal prosecution." Helen looked like she couldn't breathe. And honestly, for the first time, I think she realized power had limits. Because fear only works until the public stops being afraid. As officers moved toward the exits to control the crowd, reporters surrounded Dad. Microphones everywhere. Questions flying. "Mr. Dawson, how does it feel to be vindicated? Did you ever imagine this would happen?" Dad answered only once. "This was never about revenge," he said quietly. "People just deserve fairness." That clip went viral worldwide. Not because it was dramatic, because it was honest. Meanwhile, Helen attempted to leave through a side hallway. Didn't matter. Cameras caught everything. The panic, the anger, the collapse. One reporter shouted, "Mrs. Cartwright, do you regret having Frank Dawson arrested?" She said nothing. Another yelled, "Did you misuse HOA funds?" Still nothing. Then came the final question. "Did power go to your head?" Helen stopped walking. Only for a second. But the cameras captured her expression perfectly. Not confidence, not authority, fear, pure fear. And by midnight, every major news channel in the country was replaying the footage. The HOA Karen who arrested a widow over flowers had just been exposed live on television by the mayor himself. But the real consequences were only beginning. 6 months later, Dawson Ridge Ranch looked exactly the way my grandfather intended. Open, wild, alive. Cattle still move across the pastures every sunrise. The old red barn still leaned slightly west during heavy wind, and the cedar tree where my father rested still overlooked the north field in quiet silence. But one thing had changed forever. The ranch became a symbol, not just in Cedar Creek, across Texas, maybe even beyond, because the story spread everywhere. A family ranch targeted by an HOA, developers allegedly using pressure tactics. A retired judge walking back into battle to defend land history. People connected with it instantly, probably because deep down, everybody fears losing something meaningful to people with more money and paperwork. Silver Horizon Development Group eventually backed away completely. Too much scrutiny, too many investigations, too much public backlash. Their highway expansion partnerships quietly collapsed after regulators opened formal reviews. Multiple lawsuits followed. Several executives resigned. And Patricia Holloway? She disappeared from Cedar Creek entirely. Sold her house. Resigned from the HOA. Vanished. Some people celebrated that. Walter didn't. One evening while we repaired fencing near the south pasture, I asked him why. He leaned against the truck thoughtfully. Because greed destroys people long before consequences arrive, he said. That sentence stuck with me. Patricia lost everything chasing control. Not because she needed the money, because she wanted power, status, influence. And somewhere along the way, she stopped seeing families as human beings, only obstacles. The High Messer Estates HOA changed completely after the scandal. New leadership, financial transparency, independent oversight. Ironically, many subdivision residents later apologized personally. Several admitted they never realized how aggressively Patricia operated behind closed doors. Others confessed they stayed silent because challenging her felt impossible. Fear does that. It convinces normal people silence equals safety. Until somebody finally pushes back. That somebody turned out to be a stubborn ranch family, and one retired judge with unfinished loyalty. Walter visited often after that, sometimes helping repair gates, sometimes drinking coffee beside Mom on the porch, sometimes just sitting quietly watching sunset over the hills. He never acted like a hero, even though everybody treated him like one. One afternoon, I finally asked him the question that bothered me for months. Why did you really come help us? Walter looked toward the pasture thoughtfully, then smiled slightly. Your grandfather once told me something during that flood years ago. What? Walter adjusted his hat. Land remembers who protects it. The wind moved softly through the grass, and somehow that answer made perfect sense. Because Dawson Ridge wasn't valuable only because of oil, or acreage, or money. It mattered because generations lived there, worked there, loved there. People today forget that too easily. Everything becomes investment opportunities, development potential, market expansion. But places carry memory, history, identity. That ranch held my grandfather's fingerprints in every fence post, my father's laughter inside the barn, my mother's strength through every drought. No corporation could calculate that value. Months later, the state officially strengthened agricultural property protections, partly inspired by our case. News stations called it informal proof that public pressure still mattered. Walter called it common sense finally catching up. The funniest part, tourists actually started driving past Dawson Ridge just to see the famous ranch from television. Mom hated that initially. Then she started selling homemade peach jam from a small roadside stand, which somehow became wildly popular. Turns out surviving corporate land pressure creates excellent marketing. One sunset evening, I stood near the front gate watching cattle drift slowly across the hills. The same gate Patricia once chained shut. Only now, welded permanently above the entrance, hung a small metal sign Walter gifted us after the final case closed. It read, "This land is not for sale." Simple, direct, unbreakable. Walter walked beside me quietly, then looked toward the horizon. Your grandfather would be proud, he said. I nodded slowly. You think this fight's really over? Walter smiled faintly. Son, people with money will always want more land. Then he glanced toward the ranch. But now they know Dawson Ridge bites back. We laughed quietly. The sun dropped low across Texas hills, warm light covering the pasture gold. And for the first time since Patricia chained that gate shut, the ranch felt safe again. Not because corporations disappeared, not because greed vanished, but because people remembered something important. Communities matter. History matters. And sometimes all it takes to stop bullies is one family refusing to move, one retired judge refusing to stay retired, and one ranch stubborn enough to survive anything. The chain was gone now, but we kept the lock, mounted inside the barn, as a reminder, not of fear, of resistance, because Dawson Ridge Ranch never fell. And after everything that happened, I don't think it ever will.